The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Fallujah as Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her medical bag one final time. She had been working in the makeshift clinic for 8 months now, treating wounded civilians caught in the crossfire of a war that seemed to have no end. The 32-year-old trauma surgeon from Ohio had volunteered with Doctors Without Borders, driven by a calling to help those who needed it most. Sarah's hands were steady as she prepared for another day of surgeries, in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced medical professionals. The clinic, housed in what used to be a school building, had become a beacon of hope for the residents of this war-torn city. Despite the constant danger, she refused to abandon her patients. The sound of distant explosions had become as routine as morning coffee back home. Sarah barely flinched anymore when the windows rattled from nearby blasts. Her focus remained entirely on the young Iraqi girl lying on the operating table, shrapnel wounds covering her small body. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, and her dark eyes held a mixture of pain and trust as Sarah worked to save her life. "Doctor, we have incoming wounded," called out Ahmed, the local nurse who had become Sarah's right hand. His English was broken, but his dedication was unwavering. Together, they had saved countless lives in this improvised medical facility that operated with limited supplies and constant threats. As Sarah finished suturing the girl's wounds, she heard the familiar rumble of military vehicles approaching. This wasn't unusual. American and coalition forces often brought wounded soldiers to the clinic when their own medical facilities were overwhelmed or too far away. What made her pause was the urgency in the voices outside. The clinic door burst open, and 3 American Marines carried in their wounded comrade. Blood soaked through makeshift bandages, and the soldier's breathing was labored. Sarah immediately switched into emergency mode, her training taking over as she assessed the injuries. The soldier had taken a direct hit from an improvised explosive device, and time was running out. "Get him on table 2, Sarah ordered, already moving toward the supply cabinet. The Marines looked at her with a mixture of relief and desperation. In this moment, nationality and politics meant nothing. There was only a life that needed saving, and a doctor determined to save it. As she worked on the wounded Marine, Sarah noticed something that would later prove crucial. The soldier was wearing a communication device that continued to emit static and garbled voices. She paid little attention to it initially, focused entirely on stopping the internal bleeding that threatened to take his life. Hours passed as Sarah fought to stabilize the Marine. Ahmed assisted with typical precision, anticipating her needs before she voiced them. The other Marines waited anxiously outside, their faces etched with concern for their fallen brother. When Sarah finally emerged from the operating room, exhaustion evident in her posture, she delivered the news they hoped to hear. Their friend would live. But as the Marines prepared to transport their wounded comrade to a better-equipped facility, something went wrong. The communication device that Sarah had noticed earlier suddenly came to life with urgent voices speaking in rapid Arabic. Ahmed's face went pale as he translated the intercepted message. "Doctor, they know about the American soldier here," Ahmed whispered urgently. "Local militia groups are mobilizing. They're coming this way." Sarah felt her blood run cold. The clinic had always maintained strict neutrality, treating anyone who needed medical care regardless of their affiliation. But harboring American soldiers, even wounded ones, could be seen as choosing sides in a conflict where such choices often meant death. The Marines quickly gathered their wounded friend, but before they could leave, the sound of approaching vehicles filled the air. These weren't the organized rumbles of military convoys. These were the chaotic sounds of civilian trucks and motorcycles, the preferred transportation of local militant groups. "Back door," Sarah said quickly, leading the Marines through the clinic's rear exit. But as they moved through the building, she realized they were too late. Shouts in Arabic echoed from the front of the building, and the sound of boots on concrete told her that armed men were already inside. Ahmed grabbed Sarah's arm. "You must hide, Doctor. They know you helped the Americans. I will try to tell them you are not here." But Sarah knew that leaving Ahmed and her other local staff to face the consequences alone was not an option. These people had risked their lives daily to help her provide medical care to their community. She couldn't abandon them now. "No," she said firmly. "We face this together. We're doctors. We help everyone who needs help. That's not a crime." The voices grew closer, and Sarah could hear furniture being overturned as the armed men searched the clinic. She thought about her family back in Ohio, her parents who had begged her not to come to Iraq, her younger brother who still didn't understand why she had left her comfortable position at Cleveland General Hospital to work in a war zone. As footsteps approached the room where they were hiding, Sarah realized that her decision to save that wounded Marine might have sealed all their fates. The neutrality that had protected the clinic for 8 months was about to be shattered, and she was the one who had broken it. The door handle turned slowly, and Sarah closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer. When she opened them again, 3 masked men with AK-47 rifles were standing in the doorway, their weapons trained directly on her and her staff. One of them spoke in broken English, his voice filled with anger and accusation. "You help American soldiers. You spy for them. This place is no longer safe for our people." Sarah stepped forward, her hands raised but her voice steady. "I'm a doctor. I help anyone who is injured regardless of who they are. That's what doctors do." The man's eyes narrowed behind his mask. "Today, that changes everything." The next few hours blurred together in a nightmare of violence and terror that Sarah would never forget. The armed men had taken her and Ahmed hostage, forcing them into the back of a pickup truck while the clinic burned behind them. The months of careful neutrality that had protected the medical facility were destroyed in minutes, reduced to smoke and ash that darkened the Fallujah sky. Sarah's wrists were bound with rough rope that cut into her skin with every bump in the road. Beside her, Ahmed struggled to maintain his composure, his face showing the same determination that had made him such an invaluable partner in the clinic. Despite their desperate situation, he kept whispering words of encouragement to her in broken English. The vehicle finally stopped at what appeared to be an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Sarah was roughly pulled from the truck and pushed into a dark room that smelled of oil and decay. The concrete floor was stained with substances she preferred not to identify, and the only light came from a single bulb hanging from exposed wiring in the ceiling. Her captors removed their masks, revealing faces hardened by years of conflict. The leader, a man in his 40s with a jagged scar across his left cheek, spoke in Arabic to the others before turning his attention to Sarah. His English was better than she had initially thought, which somehow made the situation more terrifying. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell," he said, reading from what appeared to be a dossier. 32 years old, from Cleveland, Ohio. Working with Doctors Without Borders for 8 months. You have treated many of our enemies." Sarah forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "I have treated injured people. That's what doctors do." "I've helped your people, too. Children, women, elderly civilians caught in the fighting." The man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Yes, but yesterday you chose a side. You saved an American Marine who had killed 3 of our fighters just hours before. That Marine's radio was recording everything. We know you heard our communications." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had indeed heard Arabic voices coming from the Marine's radio, but she hadn't understood the language and had been too focused on saving a life to pay attention to intelligence gathering. The idea that anyone would think she was a spy seemed absurd. "I don't speak Arabic," she protested. "I was trying to save someone's life. That's all I've ever done here." But her words fell on deaf ears. Over the next several days, Sarah endured interrogations that grew increasingly violent and desperate. Her captors were convinced she had gathered intelligence for American forces, and they wanted information she simply didn't have. Each session left her weaker and more hopeless. Ahmed had been separated from her on the second day, and she could only pray that he was still alive. The young nurse had a family, a wife and 2 small children, and the thought of what might happen to them because of his association with her clinic filled Sarah with overwhelming guilt. On the 4th day, everything changed. Sarah was barely conscious when she heard the distinct sound of helicopters approaching. Her captors became agitated, shouting orders and moving equipment. Through the small window high on the warehouse wall, she could see searchlights cutting through the darkness. "American forces!" one of the men spat in English. "They have found us!" What happened next would haunt Sarah's dreams for years to come. As the rescue operation began outside, her captors made a fatal decision. If they couldn't use her for intelligence, they would make her an example. The leader who had interrogated her pulled out his sidearm and looked at her with cold determination. "You will not be rescued by your military friends," he said quietly, "but your death will send a message they will not forget." The first gunshot echoed through the warehouse like thunder. Sarah felt the bullet tear through her shoulder, spinning her to the ground. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but her medical training kicked in even through the shock. She knew she had to stay conscious, had to find a way to survive. More shots followed in rapid succession. Sarah felt bullets strike her chest, her abdomen, her legs. Each impact sent waves of agony through her body, but somehow she remained aware. Through the haze of pain, she could hear the sound of the rescue operation getting closer. American voices shouting commands, the rhythmic beating of helicopter rotors, and the distinctive crack of military rifles returning fire. The warehouse erupted in chaos as special forces breached the building. Sarah could hear gunfire exchanged between her captors and the rescue team, but the sounds seemed to be coming from very far away. Her vision was blurring, and she could feel her life slowly draining away with each heartbeat. When the shooting finally stopped, Sarah found herself lying in a growing pool of her own blood. She had been shot 14 times, and by all medical logic, she should have been dead. Her breathing was shallow and labored, each breath requiring tremendous effort. She could taste blood in her mouth and felt the familiar sensation of internal bleeding that she had diagnosed in countless patients. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard American voices approaching. Combat boots on concrete, radio chatter, and urgent medical commands. But the sounds were fading, and Sarah felt herself slipping away from consciousness. "We've got a civilian down," she heard someone shout. "Female, multiple gunshot wounds. She's barely breathing." Sarah tried to respond, to tell them she was a doctor, that she understood her injuries better than anyone, but no words came. Her body was shutting down, and she could feel herself hovering on the edge between life and death. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was a pair of steady hands checking her pulse and a voice saying, "Stay with us, ma'am. We're going to get you out of here." As consciousness faded, Sarah's final thought was not of her own survival, but of Ahmed and his family. Had he survived? Were his wife and children safe? Even facing her own death, her instincts as a healer made her think of others before herself. The warehouse fell silent except for the urgent movements of the rescue team working to stabilize her condition. Against all odds, after being shot 14 times and left for dead, Dr. Sarah Mitchell still clung to the thinnest thread of life. But whether that thread would hold long enough for rescue remained to be seen. The Navy SEALs who found Sarah in that warehouse had seen combat casualties before, but nothing quite like this. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, the team medic, knelt beside her broken body and shook his head in disbelief. 14 gunshot wounds, massive blood loss, and yet somehow this woman was still breathing. Her pulse was barely detectable, but it was there. "I've never seen anyone survive this much trauma," Rodriguez muttered as he worked to establish an IV line. "She should be dead 3 times over." The extraction was a race against time that seemed impossible to win. The SEAL team had to stabilize Sarah enough for transport while still conducting combat operations against remaining hostile forces in the area. Every second counted, and everyone knew that her chances of survival were virtually non-existent. Rodriguez worked with the precision that had made him legendary among special operations medics. He packed wounds, established multiple IV lines, and administered emergency medications while his teammates provided security. The helicopter evacuation to the nearest military hospital took 18 minutes, 18 minutes during which Sarah's life hung by the thinnest of threads. At the military hospital in Baghdad, Dr. James Thompson was completing his 3rd consecutive surgery when the emergency call came through. A civilian with massive trauma was incoming, and they needed their best trauma surgeon immediately. Thompson had been deployed to Iraq for 6 months, and he had seen horrible injuries, but when the stretcher carrying Sarah arrived, even he was stunned. "Get her to OR1 immediately," he ordered, already moving alongside the gurney. "Type and cross-match for 10 units of blood and call in every available surgeon. We're going to need all the help we can get." The surgery that followed was a marathon of medical intervention that lasted 14 hours. Sarah had sustained damage to multiple organs, including her liver, spleen, and both lungs. 3 bullets had narrowly missed her heart, and 1 had grazed her spine. The surgical team worked in shifts, with Dr. Thompson coordinating the complex operation to repair the extensive internal damage. During the surgery, something remarkable happened. Despite her critical condition, Sarah's vital signs remained surprisingly stable. Her body was fighting with a determination that defied medical explanation. Nurses who had worked trauma cases for years whispered among themselves about the unusual strength this woman was showing. "I've never seen anyone hold on like this," said Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, the head surgical nurse. "It's like she's refusing to give up." As dawn broke over Baghdad, Dr. Thompson finally stepped out of the operating room, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. Sarah had survived the surgery, though she remained in critical condition. The next 48 hours would be crucial in determining whether she would live or die. For 3 days, Sarah remained in a coma, her body slowly beginning the long process of healing. Her parents flew in from Ohio, and the sight of their daughter connected to dozens of tubes and monitors nearly broke their hearts. Her father, a retired factory worker named Robert Mitchell, sat by her bedside around the clock, holding her hand and talking to her even though doctors said she couldn't hear him. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered during the long nights. "You're the strongest person I know. Don't give up on us now." On the 4th day, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. The first thing she saw was her father's weathered face, tears streaming down his cheeks. Her throat was raw from the ventilator, and every part of her body screamed with pain. But she was alive. "Dad?" she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. The medical team was amazed by her recovery. Dr. Thompson had seen many miraculous survivals during his career, but Sarah's case was unique. Not only had she survived injuries that should have been fatal, but she was recovering faster than anyone thought possible. "Your daughter has shown incredible strength," he told her parents. "The human spirit is remarkable, but what she's accomplished goes beyond anything I've seen in 20 years of trauma surgery." The road to recovery was long and painful. Sarah underwent 7 additional surgeries to repair damage and remove bullet fragments that were too dangerous to extract during the initial operation. Physical therapy was grueling, and there were days when the pain was so intense that she wondered if death might have been easier. But gradually, she grew stronger. The nurses marveled at her determination, and visiting soldiers were inspired by her resilience. Word of her survival had spread throughout the military hospital, and she became a symbol of hope for other patients fighting their own battles. 6 weeks after the rescue, Sarah received unexpected news. Ahmed, the nurse who had been captured with her, had survived. He had been held in a different location and was rescued 2 days after her own extraction. His family was safe, and he sent a message expressing his gratitude for her courage in saving the wounded Marine that had led to their capture. "The doctor always put others before herself," Ahmed's message read. "Even when it meant danger for all of us, she could not turn away from someone who needed help. That is why she survived. Her spirit was too strong for death to take." 3 months later, Sarah was medically evacuated to Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. for continued treatment and rehabilitation. The bullet wounds had healed, but the emotional scars ran deeper. She struggled with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress, wondering why she had lived when so many others had died. It was during therapy that she found her purpose again. Working with other wounded veterans and survivors of trauma, Sarah discovered that her experience had given her a unique ability to help others heal. Her medical knowledge combined with her personal understanding of trauma created a powerful foundation for helping others recover. A year after the shooting, Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. Instead of returning to her comfortable position in Cleveland, she accepted a position as Director of Trauma Counseling at Walter Reed. She would use her experience to help other survivors find their way back to life. "I was given a second chance," she told her parents during a visit home. 14 bullets couldn't stop me from helping people. Nothing will. Dr. Sarah Mitchell's story became legendary among military medical personnel. The woman who was shot 14 times in Fallujah and survived against impossible odds had found a new mission. She would spend the rest of her career helping others overcome their own seemingly impossible challenges. When people asked her how she survived, Sarah's answer was always the same. "I had work left to do. Sometimes that's enough to keep you alive when nothing else will." The SEALs, who rescued her that night in the warehouse, had saved more than just one life. They had saved a healer who would go on to help thousands of others find their way back from the darkness of trauma and pain. In the end, Sarah's survival was not just about her own strength, but about the lives she would touch and the hope she would provide to countless others facing their own battles against impossible odds.